One of the greatest composers of all time was certainly Ludwig van Beethoven. To this day, his music inspires us as almost no one else's can. To hear his music is a joy. Yet it is a fact that Beethoven himself never heard most of it. By middle age, he had gone completely deaf. He composed much of his best music without being able to hear it. One of Beethoven's most famous and most exquisite pieces is his famous Ninth Symphony with its unforgettable Ode to Joy. By the time he wrote this, he had already been completely deaf for nearly a decade. On May 7, 1824, Beethoven conducted the premiere of this work in Vienna. At the end of a particularly moving passage, the audience went wild and the theater thundered with a tremendous ovation. Beethoven had no idea, of course, and stood turning the leaves of the score until one of the soloists pulled at his sleeve and turned him around to face the cheering crowd. Graciously, he bowed. It still amazes us to realize that such music could be written without the benefit of hearing. When asked how he did it, the deaf Beethoven replied, "I now hear as God hears." And indeed, the music he heard and captured after the distraction of other noises was no longer present remains some of the most ethereal ever composed. To hear as God hears. What would we hear if we were to listen with the ears of God? Surely we would notice much beauty and wonder that we never pay attention to, though it is before us always. The singing of the birds in the trees, the roaring of the waves on the ocean, and the thunder in the heavens, the glorious laughter of children, the majestic cacophony of human languages, the buzzing of bees, and the chirping of crickets. The whole orchestra of God's creation plays wonderfully to us, yet we are deaf to it, for we do not hear as God hears. If we were to hear as God hears, we would also hear the anguished cries of pain coming from every part of humanity, the crying children starving for bread and for love, the booms of bombs and the ravages of war, the death rattle of the planet itself, slowly and not so slowly being destroyed through human greed and apathy. Yet we are deaf to all of this too. For even though we are perfectly capable of it, we do not hear as God hears. How would we live if we were to think as God thinks? That too would certainly change everything. Yet somehow we refuse. That was the sin of Peter, for which he received the famous reproach, "Get behind me, Satan. You are thinking not as God thinks, but as human beings think." When we as individuals act out of revenge, or fear, or hatred, or apathy, we are not thinking as God thinks, but as the worst of humanity does. We are capable of so much more. When we as nations strive for power, control, and wealth, and use oppression, bullying, and war to attain it, we are certainly not thinking as God thinks. When we as church base our institution on the model of an army, or of a Renaissance court, or of a corporation, rather than the family established by the Christ, we are missing the point entirely, for we are not thinking as God thinks. Get behind me, Satan. Harsh words from the gentle Savior. Peter was, after all, only trying to protect Jesus. His sin was, to our minds, no sin at all, but to Jesus was the greatest failing. You are thinking not as God thinks, but as human beings so often do, and you are capable of so much more. All of us are capable of so much more. Yet perhaps it is only the small child who actually does hear as God hears and think as God thinks. Perhaps it is only the child who has not forgotten how. And perhaps that is why Jesus so often admonishes us to become like that child. Hear as God hears. Think as God thinks. For only of such is the kingdom of heaven.